American University in Bulgaria.
Welcome to the second event organized by Freakonomics Club this semester, and without any further ado, I will present to you Professor Leonard, who will talk about GMO agriculture, right?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This is an unusual topic for me to talk about because it's something I haven't been doing active work on this topic for quite some time, but I've been wanting to get back into it, so I think this is the perfect opportunity to do so. I've titled this presentation Between Frankenfood and Panacea, a look at GMO agriculture, partly because it's a professional responsibility of mine to try to remain as scientifically detached and as even-handed as possible, even in those situations where I might have a personal bias. And my personal bias is that I'm not a big fan of GMO food. I do try to avoid eating GMO food. But at the same time, I don't want to come forth as being an expert in why this is bad, because I haven't done research in terms of the problems of GMO. And so I do want to give a bit more even-handed presentation this evening for that reason. And there are some good things and some bad things, like there are with anything, any topic you could probably think of potentially. So just to give you a brief history, and I say history, I've got history in quotation marks because it's not quite so simple. But basically the whole idea of genetically modified organisms in agriculture in theory starts in the early 1970s with first, the Green Revolution, which was Borlaug's development of a high-yield wheat variety that really did revolutionize agriculture and has been very successful at feeding millions of people around the world. And you sort of go from that point forward to the discovery of DNA, and then of course genetic engineering developments in the 80s and 90s, and the ability to actually splice genes from one organism into another organism and to make a new organism. But in reality, genetically modified organism really begins at the point that humans start farming. And the reason why it starts back at that point is because the bulk of the techniques that are involved, the bulk of the ideas behind genetically modified agriculture, it really goes back to those original selective breeding ideals, and that is that you take a plant and you observe that it's very successful, and you look at another variety of say tomato, and you realize that both of these have some very successful traits, but not necessarily the same traits. And so you think, I will selectively breed these two tomato plants together and see if I can't get a new plant that has the characteristics that we want from each of the parents. And we've been humans have been active in hybridization really since the beginning of farming, and so that's really sort of the bulk of it, and that's kind of where it begins. I have three particular ideals here, sort of examples laid out. The first one being the Rutgers tomato. The Rutgers tomato is largely famous for two reasons. One, it was developed by Rutgers for Campbell's. So the original Campbell's soup was that comes in condensed soup. That the tomatoes that were in that tomato soup were originally the Rutgers tomato. Heinz ketchup, beginning in the 1930s, was largely made from Rutgers tomato. It was a very, very successful tomato. It had a lot of very good properties. It had excellent sugar to acid content. It was a very successful breeder. It produced firm and consistently sized produce, which of course in an industrial kind of agriculture, it's highly prized. So it's a very successful tomato in that respect. And that's really, in terms of American hybridization anyway, that's kind of the beginning, that's kind of the where things go, oh, this was a very successful sort of thing, and things come up from there. But again, it was selective breeding that got them there. They took two different varietals and crossbred them and ended up with the Rutgers tomato. Now, the second reason why it's famous is because it's gone. You can find seeds for the Rutgers tomato today, but Rutgers University officially states that those tomato seeds probably have some relationship to the original Rutgers tomato, but what that relationship is has been lost. Nobody knows. And the reason for this is because the very person who created the Rutgers tomato released the seeds. Rutgers said, after this time, it's going to be free for farmers and gardeners to use the seed as they wish. And that researcher at Rutgers made the decision that it should be free to the world to experiment in the same way that he did. And so the consequence is, of course, that everybody hybridized off of the Rutgers tomato. And that's what we've got now is some hybrids that are some kind of relatives, but we don't know what they are. So it's sort of the interesting things in terms of the hybrids is that we had a very successful hybrid in this case, and that very successful hybrid is lost for in a lot of ways the same reasons that we had it in the first place. The second one is the orange carrot. And I have a question mark here, and this is where I'm going to ask a question. Does anybody know why the carrot is orange? It is beta-carotene which causes the carrot to be orange. So chemically, that's the reason why it's orange. But there is a story, there is a legend for why the carrot is orange. And that legend, this legend is about why it's orange. Carrots in the wild come in many colors, purple and yellow and red and of course the parsnip is a relative of the carrot, and it comes in white. And the story that's probably apocryphal is that it was Dutch farmers that bred the carrot to be orange, and because it also had some other properties that people appreciated in terms of flavor and yield, the orange carrot is what we have today. And that the reason why it was Dutch farmers specifically that did this was because it was supposed to be in honor of William of Orange, the king of Holland, the Netherlands. So that's sort of an apocryphal story of hybridization for stories. Now it turns out, though, and this is why the question mark in the citation. It turns out, though, that there is an ancient Byzantine text with color pictures of carrots, and there are orange. So apparently it wasn't the Dutch. Apparently it was perhaps ancestors of some of you here that made the carrot orange. So, but we don't know. So those are the first two. The last one is chili. When I say chili, what do you think of? You think of the peppers, right? Okay. Chili is a very successful hybrid, and in fact, the chili that we know was actually originally hybridized by the Inca. If you go and find wild pepper plants in South America, you will find that the pepper plants all grow upwards. So which way do pepper plants grow if you grow them in the garden? They grow down. The reason for this is that the difference is that we have bred these pepper plants to grow larger and or longer, and to grow in the downward away from birds. This is a plant that in the wild has evolved to have its seeds spread by birds, And the heat has actually been bred into it because birds' beaks don't have pain receptors. So the birds will be able to successfully eat the pepper and take the seed and spread the seed. But mammals, where the seeds will not survive through the digestive tract, will not eat this pepper because we all have pain receptors in our mouths. And as a consequence, we won't, humans will eat them, but animals won't eat this, and it's entirely evolutionary. What the Inca did successfully was breed that out so that we could actually control the amount of heat that is in the chili. We can control how it tastes. We can control what direction it grows in. We can even control whether it grows round or long or you name it, all of the wonderful things that we can get from chili. So those basically examples of hybridization. And the reason why we hybridize is for this next term, which is heterosis. The idea is that selective breeding should give us better plants. So the theory is, and this is not the term that Darwin used, but it's very much the term that Darwin, it's very much the idea that Darwin based his scientific writings on, is the idea that we get that we have the possibility through breeding of getting the best of both of our parents. The risk, of course, being is that you don't always get the best, but that's the idea. The idea behind selective breeding is that we get heterosis. Now, what genetic engineering does is it takes this idea one step further and says, we don't have to work with seed, we don't have to work with pollen, we don't have to work with male and female plants, or male and female parts of flowers. We can do this at the genetic level, and we can engineer at the genetic level by manipulating DNA so that we can ensure that we get heterosis rather than just trying to hope that what comes from the seed of these two plants that we've bred together comes out the way that we want it to. And so that's the idea behind genetic engineering. Now, of course, the reason why we tend to talk about genetic engineering is not really specifically about taking a specific gene from a tomato plant and putting it into the sequence of another tomato plant. The reason why we're talking about genetic modification is usually because we're actually talking about taking a gene from say, a Brazil nut and putting it in a peanut. Or taking, in fact, one of the earliest examples of this that I had ever heard was that we could take the gene for blue from the indigo plant. So the gene that makes indigo blue, we could take that gene and insert it into cotton and get blue cotton. And what would be the benefit of blue cotton? We wouldn't, well, what specifically wouldn't we have to paint? Yeah, exactly. You should realize that I'm hearing this example living in Oklahoma where jeans are kind of the standard thing that you wear. And so the theory was at the time was, well, this is be great because it means no dyes, and more importantly, it also means genes that will never fade. To which almost anybody that was in their 20s at the time said, well, what good is that? That's not fashionable at all, but anyway, that's another story. But basically, that's what we're on about, is we're talking about transgenic varieties. We're talking about taking genes from one plant and putting them into a completely different plant, or indeed from a completely different species and putting it into a plant. And I'm going to focus mostly on plants in this talk because it's more widely occurring and it's more interesting to me. So that's it. So we get to GMO, genetically modified organisms, and this is actually the official EU definition of what is a genetically modified organism. And it means an organism, with the exception of human beings, in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating and or natural recombination. So if we say it's a GMO in terms of the EU, this is what it has to be. And this is really what we're talking about. But you'll notice that it's specific enough that it doesn't quite include hybrids, but it's not so specific that there's not a lot that couldn't potentially be included in this definition. And that could be, potentially a problem later. Now, some examples of transgenic GMO plants in agriculture. These are things that have actually been done. So these are plants that are actually out there. You've probably even consumed items that have been made from plants that fit one or more of these characteristics. The earliest attempts at doing transgenic varietals was to generate herbicide resistance, and probably the most famous example of this is the Monsanto's range of Roundup Ready glyphosate-resistant plants, particularly the corn and soybeans and cotton have kind of tended to be focused, but they also have Roundup Ready canola, Roundup Ready alfalfa, and Roundup Ready Kentucky bluegrass, which these last two were released just in the last few years. The idea here is that the plant is resistant to the herbicide action of this specific class of herbicide called, its generic term is glyphosate, but its brand name is Roundup. That's what Monsanto makes. The great thing about Roundup is that it kills everything. The problem, of course, with Roundup is that it kills everything. And so it is a very good, strong herbicide, except for the fact that you had prior to the mid, really about the early 90s, you had to be very careful in using this specific herbicide, because if you got it on any of your plants, the plants you actually want to harvest, those plants would die. So it's a very, very strong herbicide. I'm going to talk more about this one as we go through, but that's basically, as far as farmers are concerned, this is a really great chemical because it is so successful at killing a wide variety of broadleaf weeds, a lot of problematic weeds, particularly in the United States, but in other places as well, and particularly with respect to these plants. The second category that's been developed is actually the most fascinating, because this is the one where they actually took a gene from one species and put it into another. What these insect-resistant varieties of these products, corn, soybeans, cotton, canola, and potato, what these are genetically engineered to do is that they have a gene from a bacterium that is known to be poisonous to pretty much every insect. And so this bacterium produces a chemical that, if ingested by the insect will die. These plants are genetically engineered so that in their leaves is this chemical, which of course means that any insect that eats the leaves of these plants has ingested the chemical that is normally produced by this bacterium. Instead, it's produced at the genetic level by the plant. So these plants are highly insect resistant because, of course, after the first few insects die, none of the rest of them want to damage the crops. So they are very successful. The bacterium is called Bacillus thuringiensis. I'll just refer to it as BT because that's what we all refer to it as, is BT. Probably one of the more common ones that you've heard is probably about BT corn, because it's been very, very widely used by farmers around the world. But that's basically the idea. Now, the last one, the one that they've been doing in the last 10 to 15 years, is stacked resistance. Stacked resistance is merely that they've inserted the gene from the glyphosate resistance. They've inserted the gene for glyphosate resistance and the gene for Bacillus for BT into the same plant, so it's actually resistant to both. This is a more recent, but has quickly become quite popular with many farmers. Now, most of these plants, the reason why they're so successful and so popular is because these are for traditional agricultural produce. So these are the kinds of plants that are going to be grown for corn for human consumption, corn for cattle consumption, soybeans mostly for cattle consumption rather than human consumption. Canola primarily for the fuels market, and that sort of thing. So most of these are sort of your standard crop fields, your standard field crops that are going to be harvested for sort of further use down the road. There's another class of GMOs that have been developed for medicinal use, and probably the what I think is the best one. And the one that shows the most promise for actual use, even though it has some issues itself, is golden rice. Golden rice is golden because it contains a gene so that the rice grain, the rice endosperm, contains more beta carotene than normal. So the result is that you have a rice variety that can actually improve vitamin A uptake, particularly in poor countries like Bangladesh and the Philippines, which have a long history of childhood blindness, and it's mostly blindness due to lack of vitamin A. It's due to this vitamin A deficiency. This rice could potentially help in these countries with that specific problem. As I'm going to talk a little bit later in the next slide, there's good and bad about that, but that's really the idea behind the golden rice. The second item is that somebody has actually generated a cow through genetic modification. So this is one of our examples of a non-plant GMO in agriculture. It's a cow that produces milk without beta-lactoglobulin. Does anybody know what beta-lactoglobulin does?
It's like some bacterium, which I don't know.
It's not a bacterium, but it is a small chemical.
Well, the people who are lactose intolerant.
If you're lactose intolerant, this is your problem. This is the chemical that's causing your issue. So what they've done is that they've genetically engineered a cow that can produce milk for the lactose intolerant, which is an interesting idea. And so that's the idea behind that. They've also been using plants to generate vaccines. For instance, it's kind of the idea of the Bacillus thuringiensis. The idea is that you insert the problem gene, say smallpox, into the plant, and then the plant generates the antibodies, and so you can harvest the antibodies from the plant. And the thought is that this will be safer for use in humans because this particular production process will be less prone to creating allergic reactions further on due to the chemicals that are used in the production of antibodies at this point. So that's again another sort of a medical use of GMO. And then the last one, actually I should have put the cow and this one together. This one is xenotransplantation. This is there is a mouse, and I can't remember, I believe it's at Oxford, that they grew an ear on the back of the mouse. And this is basically the idea, except that it's not so much ears and that sort of thing as much as it is internal organs. So it's the idea that we implant pieces of of the gene sequence for certain human organs, and then the pig, which is one of the better ones for using this, is the pig then generates the organ, and then you can harvest the organ from the pig and transplant it into the human being. I'm listing this one primarily because this idea is out there. So you know that somebody is working on this idea. Whether this is a good idea or a bad idea is a whole other host of questions. But certainly somebody is thinking about it, and so that's the reason why I wanted to include it in this list. Now, this is where I try to be balanced as best I can in this talk. There are a number of hopes for GMO agriculture. There's a number of things that is the reason why this research is going on, the reason why this attempts is sort of going into this. Obviously, the ones I've talked about so far are the production benefits, the increased yields that could be possible from plants that don't suffer as much damage from certainly from insect pests or from weed competition, but in fact there's hope that we can produce antifungal peanuts or antifungal soya, because fungi are a problem in these two crops. The same with wheat, corn. It's about increasing the yields because, we've got a planet of 8 billion people to feed, and we can use all the help we can get. So that's a lot of the focus is in terms of the increased yields. The second one is to do with fuel, because one of the things that they've been working on is generating a canola plant that is capable of increasing the fatty acid production in the grain. So when you harvest the grain and you harvest the oil out of the canola seed, you have an oil product that can be more successfully converted into biofuel. And so much of the research on canola has been specifically to do this. So that'd be good because we could get more biofuel. And more biofuel has a lot of benefits in terms of the environment. The last one is also related to increased yields, and it's the ideas of increasing maturation in coho salmon, which is an American, it's an ocean variety of salmon, and the idea is that this basically halves the growing time from birth to adult salmon, thereby increasing by shortening the time to harvest. You can increase the total amount of harvest available in farm-raised salmon. So these are only for farm-raised salmon. So those are some production benefits. There's also some benefits intended for reduced agricultural use, which of course would lead to potentially cleaner water and air. If we're using less chemicals on the plants, if we're using less chemicals in the fields, that's good for farm workers, it's good for farmers, it's good for people who grew up in towns like I grew up, which was surrounded by farms. Cleaner water and cleaner air would be wonderful in terms of this, and if GMO agriculture could deliver this, then that would obviously be a wonderful thing. One of the relationships to this in terms of the cleaner water and air is the fact that is this thing about glyphosate. Glyphosate, the other than the fact that it really will kill everything. The other great thing about it is that it is much less toxic than most of its predecessors. It's certainly in the broadleaf weed chemical category. It's in fact the U.S. EPA rules that it's non-carcinogenic because it has yet to have strong evidence of carcinogens. And more importantly to most farmers is that it has not been demonstrated to have to be a neurotoxin. Nearly all of the predecessors to glyphosate were known neurotoxins, and as far as farmers are concerned, the ability to use glyphosate in this way has really been a positive thing because they have much less concern about their children being growing up near the fields, sprayed fields, because glyphosate is just not as toxic as other things. That's not to say that it's non-toxic, but I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But it's certainly less problematic than some of its predecessors. Some more hopes. GMO, if we can increase the yields, one of the ways that we're increasing the yields is by reducing the risks to farmers. If farmers have less of a problem in terms of their total expected harvest, that is if everything is perfect, what will the harvest be? That's the optimal yield. That's basically, if everything goes exactly the way it should be, GMO plants have a potential for increased optimal yield. They do yield more than conventional plants, or have the possibility for yielding more than conventional plants. The second thing is, of course, that it also reduces cuteness and kurtosis in the yield curves. And this, I went ahead and put the technical term in here because it was the best thing I could think of when I was trying to think about how to explain this. Basically, what this is doing is it's saying the year-to-year variation in crop yield due to variables that are beyond the farmer's control. So weather patterns, climate change, La Nina, El Nino cycles, all of those things that the farmers can hedge against either with irrigation or with planting sequences and this sort of thing. There are things that farmers can do to mitigate these damages in terms of farming practices. But even beyond that, GMO crops reduce the risk another order of magnitude beyond those farmer practices. And so in that respect, it's helping to ensure incomes for farmers over time. At least that's the hope. And then this last hope for GMO agriculture has to do with the medical benefits that I've mentioned. Now, this is what we expect. This is why we're doing it. This is why universities, particularly in the United States, land-grant universities have engaged in millions of dollars worth of research in trying to figure out ways of generating new seeds in this way. But now we've had about 20 years of strong planting of these seeds, and some problems have, of course, developed. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. We've done some of the benefits. Now let's talk about the costs. The first one is probably one that you've considered, and that has to do with plant patenting. The seeds of a Roundup Ready corn are governed by a patent in the United States. Monsanto held that patent. It's expiring. The reason for the patenting is to encourage the innovation. This is not cheap research. Funding labs and funding researchers is not an inexpensive business to be in, and so the patenting makes sense because the idea is that the innovation that's developed, this seed that is resistant to glyphosate, or this seed that has the ability to produce its own insect pest toxins, is certainly an innovation, and that innovation should be allowed to be governed in terms of patenting structures in a way that allows the developer to recoup the profits that should be tied to this innovation in order to encourage them to do more innovation. If you've taken my Principles of Microclass, you've already heard that lecture, and if you're taking my Principles of Microclass now, you're going to hear that lecture in another week. So sort of bear with me on that part. But there's a second piece that comes from this idea. And I don't know how I feel specifically about this yet, but the idea is this a moral question? Should biology be patentable? Should it be possible for Monsanto to control how seeds are used by farmers in such a way that protects, certain, patent structures, but potentially at the expense of positive farming practices? And that's why I'm not sure how I feel about this, because as I said, on the one hand, innovation, we're getting innovation, we're learning stuff, we're getting stuff out of this. On the other hand, I have to at least concede that the moral argument is there. I just don't know how I feel about it. But I'm going to mention, that's why I'm mentioning it, because you may have the same questions. The second one is the real problem, and that's that increased yields due specifically to GMO have not really been seen yet. It turns out that and in fact, Geary and Sherman published a research paper for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and he did some long-term studies of long-term studies of GMO yield production, and much of the yield curve increases could be explained by improvements in farming practices. And so the unfortunate thing is this certainly reduces the impact of GMO. Whether it doesn't completely eliminate the impact of GMO, but it does cause some to question whether GMO is necessarily the best or only way of getting to this final outcome. It could be that we could do just as well with other methods. It could be that we can't. What this primarily leads us to is again another question in terms of possible research. And then the last one the last problem that's really been identified has to do with the questionable changes in agricultural chemical use. And I say questionable because they're moving in opposite directions. Obviously, glyphosate use has skyrocketed. So in terms of herbicide use, it's increased quite significantly. As you would expect, if more farmers are planting glyphosate-resistant crops, the whole point of the glyphosate-resistant crop is that you can spray the entire field with glyphosate, and it will kill all of the bad plants and leave all of the good plants unharmed. And so the way that glyphosate used to be used in the old days is that you had to be very careful with your applications, that you were only getting glyphosate on the plants you actually wanted to die. And which of course means that you've gone from spraying individual plants to spraying the whole field. So obviously herbicide application has increased. However, insecticide use has gone down significantly for exactly the same reason. When you're planting plants that produce its own pesticide, you don't need to spray. That has a huge benefit. And in a lot of ways, it's the insecticides that are more toxic than glyphosate. But again, it's not non-toxic. None of this is necessarily what is safe. Well, it depends on what you think is safe. But certainly this is not thing. But unfortunately this means that in a sense, one chemical has gone up while another chemical has gone down. Are we better off? I don't know. In some ways, yes. In some ways, we have a long way to go, and that's fair. But certainly, one of the arguments originally was, "Oh, this will be great with GMO because it means that we can use less chemicals," except we aren't, at least in terms of herbicide. There are some environmental risks. Specifically, one of the environmental risks that have been demonstrated is that. Originally, it was thought that, for instance, the Bt gene in a Bt plant would remain in the GMO organism, and it wouldn't cross-pollinate and transfer that gene to a wild variety. And unfortunately, at least with wild sunflower, this has turned out to not be true. And so this is something that we've learned, unfortunately, the hard way, is that, when you're messing with genes, sometimes nature will come back and bite you, and this is one of those instances. Wild squash has also been found to be able to pick up the Bt gene from Bt squash, but not in the difference between these two is that wild sunflower hybridized itself in the field. This is natural wild sunflower that was discovered to have picked up the Bt gene from Bt sunflowers that were grown in a field, and all of this cross-pollination happened in the field. This second one is that wild squash was found to be able to successfully pick up the Bt gene from Bt squash, but this happened in the lab. These were plants that were actually crossbred to see if it would work. That's the difference between the two. But in either case, this means that we've done it in the lab and we've found it happening on its own in the wider world. And this means that obviously, if this gene can transfer on its own, how many of the other genes that we might consider putting in a genetically modified organism might be able to transfer on its own? And what will that result in if it's done out in the wild without any controls? And so it's opening up new questions about the technology. This one is one of the more important ones, and that's that there's tolerance development. Tolerance development is particularly a problem. Is particularly a problem for glyphosate. They're actually referring to these as super weeds. These are weeds that have picked up tolerance to glyphosate because they've been sprayed, because they grow near crops that are glyphosate resistant. And they've picked up on their own, they have developed by evolution their own resistance to glyphosate. And the result is that we now have 24 weed varieties worldwide since 1996 are glyphosate resistant. 22 of these since 2000. The reason why 2000 is a real marker is because two of the weed varieties that were glyphosate resistant prior to 2000 were potentially were likely to have developed that resistance on their own. These other 22 are ones that have probably developed resistance as the result of being grown near Roundup-ready fields. And so that's, unfortunately, in terms of the dating, that's why 2000 is kind of a watershed, because those are the ones that may have picked this up as the result of this GMO. This next tolerance development in terms of pests is probably a more problematic for another set of reasons. Corn rootworm has been found to be developing resistance to Bt. This is not the major pest. This is not the reason why they developed Bt corn. The reason why they developed Bt maize was to target the European corn borer, which worldwide is probably the most agronomically successful pest against corn. And so that's really what they were targeting. But the benefit was that it also hit corn rootworm and some other varieties. We have found corn rootworm, Bt-resistant corn rootworm since 2009, although it has gotten less since then. But some of that is because the climate conditions for corn rootworm have also led to reduced corn rootworm numbers, and so we're not entirely sure what this is what this is happening. But the important thing is this is really a problem for organic farmers. And the reason why this is a problem for organic farmers specifically is because the reason why we know that Bt is a successful pesticide is because Bt is what organic farmers have been using on their organic crops for decades, if not longer. And unfortunately, of course, this means that you have taken a gene out of this chemical that is available to organic farmers to control insect pests, and by inserting it into a plant, you're now potentially generating resistant insects to Bt, which means that organic farmers really don't have much in terms of available chemicals to protect their own crops. And so this is really an unfortunate situation for them because there's literally nowhere else they can go. There are cultural practices, of course. There's planting sequences. There's a host of other management practices that are available. But this was the really good one. This was the one that was kind of top of the line. This was your insurance if you're an organic farmer. And unfortunately, this insurance may be gone. It may be increasingly ineffective over time. At this point, it's been fairly limited in terms of the BT resistance, but we'll have to see what happens over time. However, interestingly enough, there is a way to prevent this, and that is that you can prevent tolerance buildup by using what's called a refugia. You know what a refugia is? It's actually a Latin word. All right, say these tables, these 6 tables in the middle, right, the ones that are lined up this way, are our field crop. Okay? In this field and in that field on that end, the 2 tables going this way, we are going to plant the same crop, except in the middle, we're going to plant the BT resistant. We're going to plant the BT version. And in the ends, we're going to plant the same crop, but not BT resistant. The hope is, and these 2 will be the refugia. The expectation is that the bugs will attack the 2 on the ends, and they will leave the middle mostly alone. And the result is that there will be fewer breeding pairs or there will be fewer breeding insects that have developed tolerance to the BT gene because they won't develop as readily in bugs that are eating in the refugia. This has actually been successful, and it is actually now it's become standard practice for farmers that are using BT crops to plant this refugia, and farmers have been doing it because the GMO planting farmers are just as afraid of this tolerance as anybody else is. So that's been discovering that this could be done has been really helpful over time. Now, how could we do that? How does this compare with sort of traditional agriculture? In a lot of ways, it compares almost directly to problems in what's considered traditional agriculture, at least in the United States, the way it's practiced in the United States and in Australia and among other countries, but especially in the United States and Canada and Australia. And that is monoculture cropping. We tend to plant fields of the same crop. And when I mean the same crop, I don't mean just that we are planting corn. That this will be our field of corn. It's actually worse than that. It's that this will be our field of corn with one specific hybrid. So the entire crop are genetically identical, which of course means that you are increasing the potential for any problems because there's no diversity in the field. By not having diversity in the field, anything that's going to kill one plant is likely to kill the entire field. And so in many respects, traditional agriculture and GMO agriculture are exactly the same because this tendency of planting an entire field in a single hybrid, crosses both of those. So we have this increased risk. Chemical tolerance, the fact is that growing in monocultures, growing the same crop year after year, having short rotations, having rotations, for instance, of corn soybeans. Corn soybeans or wheat soybeans are very popular rotations because one crop will take nitrogen out of the soil and the other one will put it back. Legumes are wonderful nitrogen fixers. Alfalfa is another one that is a known nitrogen fixer. So it will actually take nitrogen and it will put it back into the soil as the result of that cropping. So they will do these crop sequences. But again, if you're doing short rotations where you're going every other year in corn, it's a lot of work on the soil. And the result is that there's increased demand for chemical use, and there's increased chemical tolerance because you're trying to squeeze more out of the soil, and one of the things that would be helpful potentially is giving the soil a bit longer rest between corn crops. Of course, it also short rotations in monocultures also help pests because if they're successful in one year, they're going to have the possibility of being even more successful in future years because you're growing the same thing, and they're just as habitual as we are. So that makes it potentially good for them. There is also a lack of complementarities among cropping soil and other inputs. This is kind of back to the rotation thing of why longer rotations are helpful. And of course, new varieties have to replace old ones because if this hybrid now no longer works, your next option is to get the next hybrid. And you just keep moving up hybrids because you keep planting the same single culture. And at least in terms of the biology of these cropping systems, a cropping system that has more diversity in it is more likely to be successful for longer, if for no other reason than not every plant is going to be susceptible to the same problem in a given year. So that's the idea, is that it means we sort of keep having to push this. All right, so the question that I started with, Frankenfood or Panacea? Well, GMO plants have yielded some societal benefits. We've learned a lot about genetic interaction. We've learned a lot about genetic drift. That's what occurred in the sunflowers with the Bt gene. We've learned a lot about gene sequences in plants because we've been engaged in this research. So there's certainly a lot that's been learned and a lot that we could probably make positive use for the planet. GMO may also yet yield commercially successful plants at some point that aren't necessarily herbicide or insecticide focused. Unfortunately, at this point, that's really all we've been doing, are those two. But the fact is that hybrids are also not always successful. And they may not be successful for a long time. Hybrids also come and go for the same reason. So even plants that are sort of bred in a more traditional manner may not necessarily lead to a successful end. Safety and efficacy regulations remain piecemeal and potentially inadequate, especially once GMO drug and chemical crops are available. This is going to be a problem. The fact is that like with so many other innovations, kind of look at the way that we govern the internet and realize that most of those rules, are 20 years old, and when they were written, they were 50 years old. It's the same with GMO. The fact is that, it's very difficult for the law to keep up. It's very difficult for the law to be proactive. It's very difficult for the law to be, forward-looking, perfectly forward-looking. And so, in a lot of ways, we have a long way to go in terms of safety and efficacy regulations. But at the same time, benefits foregone from being overly aggressive may also be a concern. The fact is, if we just shut this down completely, we don't get anything. We kind of know what we're losing at this point, but at the same time, we have gained some knowledge and we have gained some understanding, and we've gained a lot of other things related to the fact that these crops have been available. And so if we just shut it down completely, we don't see the gains. The primary problem with golden rice at the moment, I did say I was going to come back to it, and here's where. The main problem with golden rice at the moment is that the countries that most need it are afraid of approving its use in their countries. And a lot of the reasons that they are afraid is because of some of the things that they have seen and some of the things that they have heard related to GMO agriculture. Some of the issues that have occurred in India and other places with respect to farm access and that sort of thing. Golden rice, the idea behind golden rice is that the International Rice Research Institute that developed it is allowing countries to have it basically for free. Farmers can buy golden rice just like they buy regular rice. The whole point of this development was that the rice variety was created for the sole purpose of helping people eat better and with the intention of helping prevent childhood blindness. And as a consequence, that's why they've gone out of their way of making this, of trying to make golden rice available in a way that is the most economically beneficial for poor countries. But there are still issues with the fact that it's a GMO, and that's always going to be a problem. But that's, like I said, this is one of those instances where there's clear benefits that are being lost, but of course there are also costs associated with adopting, and so we need to do a better job of being able to determine which is which. Let's see, monoculture cropping practices have the same risks for non-GMO and GMO crops. And in fact, we might learn something from GMO research that would improve traditional cropping practices. We could actually learn something potentially from GMO that might actually make organic production better without necessarily making it GMO. But again, unless we actually engage in the research, we don't know what we could possibly learn from the research. But certainly, we could gain from this. And then more broadly based agricultural research is needed. Developing better types of resistance will benefit all farmers. The fact is, if we could figure out why a chemical stops working, that's going to be really good for all farmers, conventional farmers, organic farmers, GMO farmers. Everybody is going to be better off if we can figure out, are there practices that we can do that can be consistently applied from year to year that would be of benefit to all farmers. We also need a more broad-based examination of resistance, in particular in pests. And the reason why we need a more broad-based examination is because we really need to be looking at farming processes. We need to be looking more strongly at farming practices. We have focused much of our research on chemical application, and it would be helpful if we expanded beyond that to a wider variety of research. We could do more of this. It would be, again, beneficial for everybody. And then finally, of course, we need more broadly based food drug safety research. That's always a safe one to put in when you're talking about food. Food safety is always going to be a long and difficult process. But we need to do a better job of understanding what can be safe, what can be consistently safe. And indeed, how do we do a better job of not surprising the English with horse in their lasagna? So all of these are sort of related, bundled into this situation. So I started with a question: Frankenfood or Panacea? And the answer is, this question is a false dichotomy. In all honesty, there are some Frankenfood elements, there are some Panacea elements, but really the truth is somewhere in between. And so that is the final conclusion of my talk. And just to make a point, here are my references. So thank you very much.
Thank you for
Can I
coming.
ask something? So I heard that if you hybrid two crops, they don't yield any harvest in the future. They cannot they lose the production, they use the function of reproduction. I've heard that about the animals, but I'm not sure about
Some plants will do that, and some will not. It's not a universal thing because it depends on in part on the nature of the hybrids of the parents. So if you have one full hybrid and one not full hybrid, then you can breed sterility, but not necessarily. If you have two full hybrid parents, then the odds are very good that you're going to breed sterility, but it turns out that's not, again, it's not universal. It's just much more statistically common.
Also, just to follow up, I heard that they try to fix sterility with radiation. That like somehow you can radiate the corp, which does not produce the future like generations, and they kind of radiate it, and boom, it produces. I don't know.
There were some attempts Monsanto early on had made some attempts at making it so that their plants would not cross-pollinate. Those attempts failed pretty rapidly, and so they gave them up. But we still are talking about their attempts to do that because they did attempt to do that. It's just now we have to go through the trouble of telling people, yeah, you're right, but you were right in the 80s and early 90s. You're not right now. And so the thing is, I mean, in a lot of the terms of the patents is, Monsanto wants to sell you a crop, and they want to sell you seed, and they want you to plant the seed and harvest the plant. And then they want to sell you seed next year. They don't want you to harvest or keep back part of this harvest as seed in future years because obviously that's not beneficial to them. However, the methods that they had originally tested, and that's the important thing, is that they were tested. They were never actually implemented. Most of them didn't work very well, and so they if you keep the seed, you can keep the seed. Most farmers don't keep the seed because the storage costs are more expensive than getting new seed. So it's really not an issue. But that was the idea. That was the thought is, oh, we'll do this, and yeah, stuff happened as it will in research. All right, thank you for coming.
Thank you for
This program is brought to you by AUBGTalks. For more, please visit us at aubg.bg/talks.